Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. August heat pressed against the gymnasium windows that afternoon, making the air inside thick and heavy. I just finished my third tryout session for the varsity basketball team, sweat dripping onto the polished floor as Coach Garrett called out names from his clipboard. When he said mine, everything shifted. 16 years old, standing there in my worn-out Nikes, I couldn't believe I'd actually made the cut. My best friend Jason waited outside like he always did, sitting on the concrete steps with his headphones on, bobbing his head to whatever metal band he'd discovered that week. We'd been tight since elementary school, when his family moved to our neighborhood in central Ohio. His dad fixed cars and mine sold insurance, but somehow we clicked immediately. Two kids who spent every free moment together, whether building ramps for our bikes or staying up all night playing video games in his basement. Jason barely glanced up when I pushed through the double doors, his face already telling me he knew. He'd tried out too, all 3 days, giving everything he had despite being 5 inches shorter than most guys there. His jump shot was decent, better than mine, honestly. But Coach wanted height and speed for the upcoming season. I sat down beside him on those steps, the concrete still warm from the afternoon sun, trying to find the right words. He pulled off his headphones and forced this weird half-smile that didn't reach his eyes, said congratulations in a voice that sounded like someone else entirely. That moment stays with me because it was the first crack in something I thought would last forever. The next few weeks brought changes I didn't see coming. Practice started immediately, 2 hours every morning before school, another 3 after classes ended. My new teammates welcomed me with open arms, especially the captain, Bradley Turner, who everyone just called BT. He drove a black Jeep Wrangler and had this way of making everyone around him feel important. The guys would hang out at his place after practice, his parents' massive house with a pool table in the basement and a fridge always stocked with energy drinks. They invited me constantly, and each time I said yes meant saying no to Jason. Our afternoon bike ride stopped. The late-night gaming sessions disappeared. I kept telling myself it was temporary just until I settled into the team routine, but deep down, I knew I was choosing a different path. Jason started changing too, though I was too caught up in my new life to really notice at first. He grew quieter, stopped waiting for me after school, started wearing all black and hanging out with kids I'd never seen before. His texts became shorter, sometimes just single words or weird symbols I didn't understand. One night I found him sitting in the park where we used to play as kids, carving something into the wooden picnic table with his pocket knife. When I asked what he was doing there so late, he just stared at me with these empty eyes and said he was practicing. Practicing for what, he wouldn't say. I should have pressed harder, should have recognized the warning signs, but BT had just texted about a party at his place, and I made up some excuse about having to get home. By October, our friendship had become a ghost of what it used to be. I'd see Jason in the hallways between classes, always lurking near my locker or watching from across the cafeteria. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at BT with this intense focus that made my chest tight. He started leaving things in my locker, old photos of us from middle school, torn pages from notebooks covered in angry scribbles, even a dead sparrow wrapped in newspaper once. The other guys on the team noticed too. They'd joke about my creepy stalker friend, and I'd laugh along pretending it didn't bother me. BT was less amused, especially after Jason showed up at 3 different team events uninvited, just standing at the edge of the crowd, never talking to anyone, always watching. Everything came to a head on a Thursday in November. Practice had run late because we were preparing for our first real game of the season. Coach kept us doing suicide drills until our legs felt like rubber, and by the time we hit the showers, the sun had already set. I was the last one in the locker room, taking my time because my mom was working late and wouldn't be home anyway. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, just an address and the words, "He needs you to come alone." The address was for an abandoned construction site on the outskirts of town, a place where they'd started building condos 2 years ago before the developer went bankrupt. My gut twisted as I read it again. The writing style, the way the words were spaced. It was Jason, using a burner phone probably. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to go home and pretend I never got the message, but something in those 5 words made my skin prickle with dread. I drove out there in my beat-up Toyota, the headlights cutting through patches of fog as I left the main roads behind. The construction site looked like a graveyard of ambitions, half-built structures reaching up into the darkness, piles of rusted rebar scattered everywhere, concrete mixers frozen in time like prehistoric creatures. No other cars in sight. I parked near the entrance and killed the engine, sitting there for a full minute, listening to my own breathing. Every rational thought told me to leave, to call someone, maybe even the police, but curiosity and some twisted sense of loyalty pulled me forward. I grabbed the flashlight from my glove compartment and stepped out into the cold November air. The wind whistled through the skeletal buildings, carrying the smell of wet concrete and decay. The main structure loomed ahead, a 3-story shell with gaping holes where windows should have been. I picked my way through the debris, my flashlight beam dancing across graffiti-covered walls and puddles of stagnant water. Then I heard it, a low moaning sound coming from somewhere deeper in the building. Not quite human, not quite animal, just wrong enough to make every hair on my arms stand up. I followed the sound up a makeshift staircase, the metal groaning under my weight. On the 2nd floor, in what would have been a corner apartment, I saw them. BT was there, but not how I'd ever seen him before, tied to a support beam with industrial zip ties, his varsity jacket torn and bloody, duct tape across his mouth. His eyes went wide when he saw me, frantically shaking his head, trying to scream through the tape. Jason stepped out from behind a concrete pillar, and I barely recognized him. He'd shaved his head completely bald, and in the harsh beam of my flashlight, I could see strange marks carved into his scalp, symbols that looked almost like letters but weren't quite right. He wore all black, including gloves that were stained dark with what I realized was BT's blood. In his right hand, he held a crowbar, tapping it rhythmically against his leg. But it was his smile that haunts me most, wide and genuine, like we were meeting up for a movie instead of standing in this nightmare. "You came," he said, his voice oddly cheerful. "I knew you would. Real friends always show up." He moved closer, and I could see his pupils were dilated so wide his eyes looked completely black. "We need to talk about loyalty, about what happens when people forget where they came from." I tried to keep my voice steady, tried to reach whatever was left of my old friend in there. Asked him to let BT go, told him we could work this out, that I was sorry for everything. Jason laughed, but it came out broken, like static on a bad radio connection. He walked over to BT and pressed the crowbar against his ribs, making him writhe against the restraints. "You think sorry fixes anything? You think sorry brings back 8 years of friendship you threw away for this?" He gestured wildly at BT with the crowbar. "He doesn't even know your middle name, doesn't know you're afraid of moths, or that you still sleep with that ratty stuffed dinosaur your dad gave you before he left. I know everything about you, and you replaced me with someone who sees you as just another teammate." The crowbar came down hard on BT. His knee, and even through the duct tape, his scream was piercing. Jason turned back to me, tears streaming down his face now, mixing with the dried blood on his cheeks. "But I'm going to fix everything. After tonight, you'll never forget me again." That's when I noticed the jerry can in the corner, the smell of gasoline suddenly overwhelming in the enclosed space. Jason saw me looking and nodded enthusiastically, like a kid showing off a school project. "Fire purifies," he said, picking up the can and starting to splash gasoline around BT's feet. "Burns away the fake friendships, the lies, all of it. You're going to watch him burn, and then you're going to understand what real loss feels like." My mind raced, calculating distances, angles, possibilities. Jason was focused on his ritual, muttering words I couldn't understand, lost in his own delusion. I saw my chance when he set the can down to pull out a lighter. I charged forward, tackling him hard into the concrete wall. We went down in a tangle of limbs, the crowbar clattering across the floor. Jason was stronger than I remembered, fueled by whatever drugs were coursing through his system. But I had desperation on my side. We rolled through the gasoline puddles, throwing wild punches until I managed to get on top and pin his arms down. The police found us like that 20 minutes later, me holding Jason down while he screamed about betrayal and blood oaths, BT still tied to the beam but alive, the whole floor reeking of gasoline. Turns out BT had managed to activate the emergency SOS on his smartwatch before Jason took his phone. They took Jason away in restraints, still ranting about purification and true friendship. He's in a psychiatric facility now, has been for the past 2 years. They said he had a complete psychotic break, triggered by rejection and isolation. I quit the basketball team the next week, couldn't stand being in that gym anymore. BT recovered physically, but we never really talked after that night. Sometimes I drive past that construction site, now finished condos where young families live, and wonder if they ever feel the weight of what almost happened there. I still have nightmares about Jason's face that night, about how someone I loved like a brother could transform into something unrecognizable. The guilt eats at me because I know I played a part in breaking him. Success isn't worth losing yourself, and it definitely isn't worth losing the people who knew you before you thought you were somebody special. The fog that morning was unlike anything I'd seen in my 23 years living in Oregon. I worked as a night shift nurse at Providence Medical Center, and my routine was sacred to me. Finish my 12-hour shift at 6 in the morning, drive home, change into my running gear, and hit the trails by 6:30. That particular morning in early November, I could barely see my own car in the hospital parking lot. The fog was so thick it seemed to swallow sound itself, creating this eerie silence that made my footsteps echo strangely on the asphalt. But I was stubborn, you know. Running was how I decompressed after dealing with emergencies all night, and I wasn't about to let some weather mess with my routine. I lived in this quiet neighborhood called Riverside Heights, about 15 minutes from the hospital. The area had these beautiful running trails that wound through patches of forest and connected to a larger park system. My apartment was in one of those converted Victorian houses, and I remember standing on my porch that morning, lacing up my shoes while this wall of gray pressed against everything. Mrs. Nguyen from next door was bringing in her cat, and she actually called out to me, asking if I really planned to run in this soup. I just laughed it off, told her I'd stick to the main paths. The visibility was maybe 10 feet at most, but I figured I knew these trails like the back of my hand. I'd been running them every morning for 3 years straight. The first quarter mile went fine. I kept to the sidewalk, passing familiar landmarks, the blue mailbox at the corner, the house with the ridiculous lawn gnome collection, the bus stop where teenagers always left their energy drink cans. But once I hit the trail entrance, everything changed. The fog seemed denser there, if that was even possible, like it was pouring out from between the trees. I had to slow my pace significantly because I kept nearly tripping over roots and rocks I couldn't see until they were right under my feet. The strangest part was how the fog muffled everything. My breathing sounded loud and harsh but distant at the same time, like I was hearing someone else running. Even the birds were quiet, which should have been my first real warning sign. About 10 minutes in, I reached the spot where the trail splits. Left goes deeper into the woods toward the creek. Right stays closer to the neighborhood. I always went left because it was more challenging, with some decent hills and a nice long straightaway by the water. But standing there at that fork, I felt this weird reluctance. Not fear exactly, just this heaviness in my chest, like my body was trying to tell me something my brain wasn't ready to hear. I actually stood there for a good 30 seconds, my breath creating these little clouds that immediately disappeared into the larger fog. Finally, I shook my head at my own silliness and turned left, picking up my pace again to make up for lost time. The deeper I went into the woods, the more the world seemed to shrink around me. I couldn't see the trees until I was practically running into them, just these dark pillars suddenly materializing out of the gray. The trail, which I knew was about 6 feet wide, felt like a narrow tunnel. I kept having to reach out and touch the bark of passing trees just to orient myself, and the texture felt wrong somehow, too soft, almost spongy under my fingers. The fog was doing something to my perception of distance too. I'd think I was approaching the wooden bridge that crosses the creek, but then I'd run for another minute and still no bridge. When I finally did reach it, the sound of my footsteps on the planks was flat and dull. Nothing like the usual hollow echo I loved. That's when I heard the humming. It was faint at first, barely distinguishable from the sound of the creek below, but it was definitely human. A woman's voice humming this slow, meandering tune I didn't recognize. The melody kept breaking off and starting over, like she couldn't remember how it went. I slowed to a walk, my heart rate spiking for reasons that had nothing to do with exercise. The humming was coming from somewhere ahead, but in that fog, it could have been 20 feet or 200. I called out a tentative, "Hello?" and the humming stopped immediately. The silence that followed was so complete it made my ears ring. Then I heard footsteps, slow, uneven, like someone was dragging one foot. They were coming toward me. She emerged from the fog like something out of a nightmare. The first thing I saw was her hair, long, dark, and matted with what looked like mud or something else. She was wearing a white nightgown that was torn at the shoulder and stained with dark patches. Her feet were bare, which explained the dragging sound. Her left foot was leaving a smear of blood on the trail with each step. But it was her face that made me take an involuntary step backward. Her eyes were wide and unfocused, pupils dilated so much they looked black, and she had this expression of complete bewilderment, like she had no idea where she was. Her lips were moving, mouthing words I couldn't hear. And her right hand, God, her right hand was clenched around something dark and wet. "Are you okay?" I managed to ask, though my voice came out as barely a whisper. She tilted her head at the sound, and for a moment her eyes seemed to focus on me. Then she smiled, this horrible, vacant smile, and held up her clenched fist. "I found it," she said in a voice that was eerily calm. "He was hiding it from me, but I found it." She opened her hand, and I saw what she was holding. It was a finger. A human finger, still wearing a gold wedding band, the knuckle end ragged and wet. The nail was painted bright red, chipped at the tip. I must have made some kind of sound because she looked down at it, almost surprised, like she'd forgotten she was holding it. "Oh," she said softly, "this isn't mine." Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but my nursing training kicked in. This woman was clearly in crisis, psychological, medical, or both. The blood on her feet, her dilated pupils, the complete disconnection from reality. She needed help. I forced myself to speak calmly, keeping my distance. "I'm a nurse," I said. "You're hurt, let me help you." She blinked slowly, like she was processing the words from very far away. Then she took a step toward me, still clutching that finger. "He wouldn't tell me where he put them," she said conversationally. "So I had to look everywhere, under the floorboards, inside the walls. But this one was in his pocket the whole time." "Can you believe that?" She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. And I noticed her other hand was bleeding too, fingernails torn and caked with what looked like drywall dust. I pulled out my phone with trembling fingers, trying to dial 911 while keeping my eyes on her. The fog seemed to press closer, and I realized I had no idea which direction led back to the main trail. She was between me and the way I'd come, swaying slightly on her feet like she might collapse at any moment. "What's your name?" I asked, stalling for time while the phone rang. She frowned, looking genuinely puzzled. "I used to know that," she said, "but he took that too. He takes everything." The 911 operator answered just as she lurched forward, reaching for me with her bloody hands. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my phone, and that's when I heard it. Sirens, multiple sirens, somewhere in the distance. The woman heard them too. Her whole body went rigid, and she looked around wildly like a trapped animal. "They're coming for me," she whispered. They always come for me. Before I could react, she turned and ran, or tried to run, disappearing into the fog with that awful dragging gait. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Phone pressed to my ear while the operator asked questions I couldn't process. Finally, I managed to explain where I was, sort of, and that there was an injured woman who needed help. The operator told me to stay put, that officers were already in the area responding to an incident. I found a large tree and put my back against it, scanning the fog in every direction. The sirens were getting louder, and I could see flashes of red and blue light filtering through the mist. About 5 minutes later, 2 police officers appeared on the trail, flashlights cutting through the gloom. They looked tense, hands near their weapons. When they saw me, just a jogger in running gear, they relaxed slightly. "Ma'am, did you see a woman pass through here?" one asked. I nodded and started to explain, but he cut me off. "Which way did she go?" I pointed into the fog, and they took off running, talking rapidly into their radios. A third officer stayed with me, escorting me back to the main trail where more police cars and an ambulance were waiting. That's when I learned the truth. The woman's name was Diane Holbrook, and she'd been reported missing from a psychiatric facility 3 days earlier after attacking a staff member. But that wasn't the worst part. About an hour before I encountered her, her husband had called 911 from their home 2 miles away. She'd shown up at their house in the middle of the night. He'd been trying to get her involuntarily committed, which triggered her escape from the facility. When he wouldn't let her in, she'd broken a window and attacked him with a kitchen knife. He'd lost 3 fingers trying to defend himself before managing to lock himself in the bathroom. She'd fled when she heard the sirens. They found her about an hour later, hypothermic and catatonic, huddled under the wooden bridge I'd crossed. The finger she'd been carrying was her husband's index finger. He survived, thank God, though he needed multiple surgeries. As for me, I took a week off from running, and when I finally went back to the trails, I never ran alone in the fog again. Sometimes, on misty mornings, I still hear phantom humming in the distance, and I turn around and head straight home. I need to tell someone about what happened that night in June 2018. I was living in Sacramento then, barely scraping by doing things I'm not proud of, stealing wallets, breaking into cars, whatever kept the lights on. My mother had gotten sick that spring, and between her treatments and my own rent, legitimate work just wasn't cutting it anymore. I'd been casing houses in Willowbrook, this pristine suburb where people left their garage doors open and Amazon packages sat on porches all day. There was this one place on Maple Street that caught my attention, a modest 2-story with overgrown hedges that gave it privacy from the neighbors. The owner was a paramedic named Christopher Walsh, and I'd watched him long enough to know his patterns. 4 days on, 3 days off, always left for his shift at 5:30 p.m. sharp in his navy blue uniform. That Thursday night, I knew Walsh was working until morning. I'd seen him leave earlier, medical bag slung over his shoulder, getting into his Ford Explorer like clockwork. The house sat dark except for a single porch light, and the nearest neighbor was separated by a thick row of evergreen trees. I remember sitting in my beat-up Corolla down the block, counting down the hours until midnight, telling myself this would be my last job. Just grab some electronics, maybe some jewelry, fence it all by the weekend, quick and clean. I'd done it dozens of times before, but something about that house made me hesitate. Maybe it was how the windows seemed to watch the street, or how even the shadows in the yard seemed deeper than they should be. But I pushed those thoughts aside. I needed the money, and Walsh wouldn't be home for hours. Getting inside was easier than it should have been. The back door had one of those old pin tumbler locks that I could pick in my sleep. No alarm system either, which surprised me given the neighborhood. I slipped through the kitchen, using my pen light to navigate past granite countertops and stainless steel appliances that probably cost more than my car. The place smelled weird though, not bad exactly, but clinical, like a hospital mixed with something sweet and metallic. I found the living room and started filling my backpack with the usual stuff. A tablet left on the coffee table, Some vintage-looking watches from a display case, a small jewelry box from the mantel. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you hear your own heartbeat. That's when I noticed the basement door. It was painted the same beige as the walls, almost invisible except for the heavy-duty deadbolt installed on the outside. Not to keep people out, to keep something in. I should have left right then. Should have taken what I had and gotten the hell out of there, but I kept thinking about what kind of valuables someone would lock up that securely. Maybe a safe or a collection worth real money. The deadbolt was new, a Medico, but the wood around it was soft from years of settling. 5 minutes with my pry bar and I had it open. The smell hit me immediately. That same clinical sweetness, but stronger, mixed with something else, something organic and wrong. A wooden staircase descended into darkness, and I could hear a faint humming coming from below, like an old refrigerator or freezer running. Each step creaked under my weight as I descended, the penlight beam cutting through the darkness ahead of me. The basement was finished with drywall and fluorescent lights I didn't dare turn on. The humming grew louder, and now I could make out other sounds, a dripping faucet, the buzz of electricity, and something else. Something rhythmic, like breathing but not quite. The smell was overwhelming down here, making my eyes water and my throat burn. I covered my nose with my shirt and pushed forward, following a narrow hallway that led deeper into the basement. The walls were lined with metal shelving units, and as my light passed over them, I saw mason jars. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, each filled with murky liquid and things, floating things. At first I thought they were medical specimens. Walsh was a paramedic after all. But then I saw the labels written in neat handwriting with dates and names. Melissa, 2016, third finger. Catherine, 2017, left ear. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. The hallway opened into a larger room, and that's where I found her. She was maybe 19 or 20, zip-tied to a medical gurney in the center of the room, duct tape over her mouth, eyes wide with terror when my light hit her face. She was wearing a torn college sweatshirt, Cal State Sacramento, and one of her shoes was missing. The gurney was surrounded by medical equipment I recognized from movies. IV stands, those rolling tables with surgical tools, bright examination lights mounted on adjustable arms. But this wasn't a hospital. The concrete floor had dark stains spreading out from a drain in the center, and the walls were covered in photographs. Polaroids, hundreds of them, showing women at different stages of... I couldn't look at them. The girl on the gurney started thrashing when she saw me, making muffled screams through the tape, tears streaming down her face. I rushed over and started cutting through the zip ties with my pocket knife, whispering for her to stay quiet, even though every instinct screamed at me to run. Her wrists were raw and bleeding where she'd been struggling against the restraints. As soon as I got the tape off her mouth, she gasped, "He'll be back. He always comes back during his break to check on me." "Please, please, we have to go now." But before I could get her legs free, we heard it. The unmistakable sound of a car door slamming outside. Heavy footsteps on the porch above us. The girl's whole body went rigid with panic. "Hide," she whispered, her voice cracking. "If he finds you here." The front door opened upstairs and we could hear Walsh's voice, humming some tune I didn't recognize. His footsteps moved through the house with casual familiarity, heading straight for the kitchen. Then they stopped, and I knew. He'd noticed the basement door. The change was immediate. The humming stopped, replaced by silence so complete I could hear the girl's ragged breathing beside me. Then came the slow, deliberate footsteps moving toward the basement door. "Amber?" Walsh's voice drifted down, conversational and calm. "I know you've been trying to get loose again. You know what happens when you make me come down there." The girl, Amber, grabbed my arm with her free hand, her nails digging into my skin. I looked around frantically for another exit, but there was only the one staircase. We were trapped. I pulled Amber behind one of the metal shelving units, pressing us both against the wall. The footsteps started down the stairs, each creak making my heart race faster. "Strange," Walsh said, his voice closer now. "I distinctly remember locking this door. Amber, have you been making friends? His tone was playful, like this was all some kind of game. He reached the bottom of the stairs and I could see his shadow stretching across the floor through the gaps in the shelving. Walsh was bigger than I had expected. Not tall exactly, but broad, with the kind of build that came from lifting bodies onto gurneys for a living. He walked slowly through his collection, running his fingers along the jars like a wine collector admiring his vintages. "You know, Amber, I've been thinking about you all evening. Had a cardiac arrest call earlier, elderly woman, didn't make it. The family was so grateful when I tried to save her. They have no idea that death follows me home." He laughed, a sound that made bile rise in my throat. Amber was trembling against me, her breath coming in short gasps that I was terrified he would hear. Walsh moved closer to our hiding spot, and I could see him clearly now. Still in his paramedic uniform, his badge reading C. Walsh, saving lives since 2009. The irony made me sick. Then his radio crackled to life. "Unit 47, we need you back at base. Multi-vehicle accident on Highway 50, all hands needed immediately." Walsh stopped moving, his hand reaching for the radio on his belt. For a moment, nobody moved. Then he sighed, pressing the talk button. "Unit 47 responding. ETA 15 minutes. He stood there for another moment, and I was certain he knew we were there. But then he turned toward the stairs. "Don't go anywhere, Amber. We'll continue our session when I get back. This accident sounds messy. Might be gone for hours." His footsteps retreated up the stairs and we heard the door close. The deadbolt clicked into place from the outside. We were locked in. Amber collapsed against me, sobbing. "He always locks it," she whispered. "Even when he leaves. There's no way out." But I wasn't giving up. Not when we'd gotten this lucky. I helped her back to the gurney and finished cutting her free, then started searching the room. There had to be another way. Behind the collection of photos, I found it. A small window near the ceiling, painted over but definitely there. It was narrow, maybe 18 inches wide, but Amber was small enough to fit through. I dragged the gurney underneath it and climbed up, using my pry bar to break the paint seal and force it open. Fresh air rushed in, and I could see we were at ground level on the side of the house. "You first," I told Amber, making a step with my hands. She was weak from whatever he'd done to her, but adrenaline gave her strength. As I boosted her up, she whispered, "What about you?" I was too broad in the shoulders. There was no way I'd fit. "Just go," I said. "Get to the neighbors, call 911, tell them everything." She squeezed through and I heard her drop onto the grass outside. Then silence. I jumped down and ran back through the basement, past those horrible jars, up the stairs. I threw my full weight against the door, over and over, until the frame finally splintered and gave way. I burst out of the house and found Amber waiting by my car, shaking but alive. We drove straight to the police station, no stops, no looking back. The next few hours were a blur of statements and questions. They sent units to Walsh's house immediately, but he never returned from that accident call. Turns out he'd been monitoring police radios in his ambulance and heard the chatter about his address. They found his abandoned vehicle 3 counties over and launched a massive manhunt. They also found evidence in that basement linking him to 14 missing women over 8 years. 14. The story made national news. Paramedic of death, they called him. Walsh is still out there somewhere. They never caught him. Amber went into witness protection after testifying before the grand jury, and I served 6 months for the burglary. The DA cut me a deal considering the circumstances. I'm clean now, working construction, living a normal life. But sometimes I wake up at night thinking about those jars, those photos, and wondering if Walsh is out there in some other city, wearing a different uniform, saving lives by day and taking them by night. Thursday nights at the grocery store were always my thing. After putting my 3-year-old daughter, Chloe, to bed, I'd leave her with my husband, Nathan, and do our weekly shopping in peace. It was November 2022, and we'd just moved to a small town in Colorado for Nathan's new job at the power plant. Life was good. We had a little ranch house with a big backyard. Chloe was thriving in her new preschool, and I'd even started making friends at the local moms group. That particular Thursday started like any other. I kissed Nathan goodbye around 8:30, grabbed my reusable bags, and headed to the Save Mart on the edge of town. The parking lot was mostly empty by then, just a few cars scattered under those harsh yellow lights that made everything look sickly. I remember feeling accomplished as I loaded the groceries into my old Ford Explorer, got everything on my list, even scored some deals on Chloe's favorite yogurt. The temperature had dropped while I was inside, probably hit the low 30s, and I could see my breath fogging up in the cold air. When I turned the key, the engine made this horrible grinding noise, like metal scraping against metal. Then nothing. Just that clicking sound that tells you something seriously wrong. I tried again, pumping the gas pedal even though Nathan always told me that doesn't help with modern cars. Click, click, click. My phone showed 9:47 p.m. The store would close in 13 minutes, and most of the employees' cars were already gone from the lot. I could see the night manager through the big windows, starting to dim the lights inside. I grabbed my phone to call Nathan, but then remembered he'd mentioned taking a sleeping pill early that night. He'd been having trouble adjusting to the night shifts. Once he was out, nothing could wake him. My next thought was AAAA, but we'd let our membership lapse during the move. Stupid, I know. I scrolled through my contacts, trying to think of someone local who could help. The moms group ladies all lived on the other side of town, at least 20 minutes away. I was weighing my options when I heard footsteps on the asphalt. A man was walking toward me from the direction of the dumpsters at the far end of the lot. He wore dark work clothes, the kind with reflective strips on the sleeves, and carried what looked like a toolbox. "Car trouble?" he called out, his voice carrying that friendly, helpful tone that makes you instinctively relax. He was maybe mid-40s, average height, with one of those faces that just looks trustworthy. You know the type, like someone's dad who coaches Little League. "Yeah, it won't start," I said, rolling down my window halfway. He had this easy smile, the kind where his whole face crinkled up, and I noticed he was wearing a baseball cap with Morrison Auto Repair stitched on it. Except it wasn't Morrison. It was something else, but the lighting made it hard to read. "Mind if I take a look?" he asked, already walking around to the front of my car. "I'm heading home from a late service call, but I've got a few minutes. Hate to see someone stranded out here." He set his toolbox down with practiced ease, and I noticed his hands. Clean for a mechanic, but with that ingrained grease under the nails that never quite comes out. There was something oddly specific about the way he moved, like he'd done this exact thing 1,000 times before. Looking back, that should have been my first real warning sign. Not the movement itself, but how perfectly rehearsed it all seemed. I popped the hood for him, and he propped it open with one smooth motion. The way he leaned into the engine compartment, flashlight in hand, looked completely natural. Professional, even. "When's the last time you had the battery checked?" he asked, his voice muffled by the hood. I told him I wasn't sure. Probably not since we bought the car 3 years ago. He made this sympathetic clicking noise with his tongue. "Cold weather's hard on batteries, especially these newer models with all the electronics." He poked around for a few more minutes, occasionally asking me to try turning the key so he could listen. Each time, same result. That grinding noise followed by clicks. What struck me as strange was how he never actually touched anything in the engine. His hands hovered over various parts, the flashlight beam dancing around, but he never made contact with any component, like he was putting on a show rather than actually diagnosing the problem. "Tell you what," he said, straightening up and wiping his hands on a rag from his pocket. "I've got jumper cables in my truck. It's parked just around the corner. Didn't want to take up a customer spot, you know? Give me 2 minutes." He had this way of making eye contact that felt both direct and somehow empty, like he was looking through me rather than at me. Before I could respond, he was already walking away, his toolbox swinging slightly with each step. That's when I noticed something that made my chest tighten. His work boots left wet prints on the asphalt, but it hadn't rained in days. The parking lot was bone dry except for those footprints trailing back toward the dumpsters. Where had he been that his boots were wet? I looked down at my phone again, 9:56 p.m. The store lights were almost all off now, just the security lighting left. Through the reflection in my side mirror, I could see the night manager locking the front doors. Something made me want to call someone, anyone, while he was gone. I dialed the local mechanic shop, Eddie's Auto Service, where we'd taken the Explorer for an oil change last month. They had a 24-hour emergency line. As the phone rang, I kept glancing toward where the man had disappeared. On the third ring, a gravelly voice answered. "Eddie's Auto, this is Frank." I explained my situation quickly, mentioned the helpful mechanic who'd stopped to help. "What mechanic?" Frank asked, suddenly alert. "We don't have anyone out on calls tonight. All our guys clocked out by 6. My mouth went dry, but he said, his hat said something auto repair. There was a pause. "Ma'am, where are you exactly?" When I told him, he said something that made my whole body go rigid. "Lock your doors right now. We've had reports of someone impersonating mechanics at night. I'm calling the police and sending our actual emergency guy. His name's Carl, drives a white van with our logo. Don't get out of your car for anyone else." The line went dead, and I immediately locked all my doors, my fingers fumbling with the buttons. That's when I saw him coming back through my rearview mirror. No truck followed him, no jumper cables in his hands. Just him, walking with that same measured pace, that same empty smile visible even from a distance. But now he was coming from a completely different direction. Not from where he'd said his truck was parked, but from the shadowy area behind the store where the delivery trucks unload. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. He approached my driver's side window and knocked gently, tilting his head when he saw the window was now rolled up tight. "Small problem," he said, his voice muffled through the glass. "Forgot my keys in your engine, need to grab them real quick." Keys. He hadn't put any keys in my engine, he hadn't put anything anywhere. I shook my head, not trusting my voice. His smile faltered for just a second, and in that moment his whole demeanor shifted. The mask slipped, and underneath was something cold and calculating. "Come on now," he said, his tone still friendly but with an edge that wasn't there before. "Just pop the hood, 2 seconds." He placed his hand flat against my window, and I could see dirt caked under those supposedly greasy fingernails. Not oil or grease, dirt. Like he'd been digging. His other hand moved to his toolbox, fingers drumming against the metal surface in an irregular rhythm that seemed almost anxious. Through the glass, I could hear him breathing, these short, sharp exhales that didn't match his calm expression. "I'm waiting for ADA," I lied, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. "They'll be here any minute." His hand pressed harder against the window, leaving a smudged print. "AAA? That's funny. See, I've been watching this lot for the past hour. No one's called anyone." That's when I noticed the earpiece, barely visible, a thin wire disappearing into his collar. Who was he talking to? Or worse, who was talking to him? The sound of sirens in the distance made him step back from my car. Not police sirens, different. A car alarm maybe, but getting closer. He looked toward the main road, then back at me, and his expression was no longer friendly at all. It was frustrated, angry even. Like a predator whose prey had somehow slipped the trap. "You got lucky," he said so quietly I almost couldn't hear it through the glass. Then louder with that fake friendliness again. "Looks like you've got help coming after all." He picked up his toolbox, gripping it differently now, holding it more like a weapon than a tool carrier, and started backing away. But he wasn't leaving. Not really. He moved to a dark sedan parked 3 spaces away, one I hadn't noticed before. The dome light came on when he opened the door, and I glimpsed someone else inside, a shadow in the passenger seat leaning forward, watching. The man tossed his toolbox in the back and slammed the door, but the engine didn't start. They just sat there, waiting. A white van with Eddie's Auto Service painted on the side pulled into the lot fast, tires squealing slightly on the turn. Right behind it, 2 police cruisers with lights blazing. The sedan's engine roared to life, and it peeled out of the parking space heading for the exit. But the police were ready. One cruiser blocked the exit while the other gave chase. The whole thing happened in maybe 30 seconds. but it felt like a lifetime. Carl from Eddie's jumped out of his van and jogged over to me, holding his ID up high so I could see it clearly through the windshield. Only then did I unlock my door. "You okay, ma'am?" he asked, real concern in his voice. "Frank told me to get here fast. That was them, wasn't it? The guys who've been doing this?" I nodded, suddenly unable to stop shaking. Carl walked around to my hood, talking the whole time, explaining everything he was doing. "Let me just check." "Oh, Jesus." His face went pale. "Ma'am, step out of the car, please. Stay back." What Carl found under my hood still gives me nightmares. Wedged between the battery and the engine block was a hunting knife, positioned so that if I'd actually managed to start the car, the fan belt would have snapped and sent it flying. But that wasn't the worst part. There was a small device attached to the knife, something electronic with wires running to my brake lines. The police later told me it was homemade, designed to puncture the lines after a certain amount of pressure. If my car had started and I'd driven away, I would have lost my brakes within a mile. They caught both men trying to ram through the police blockade. In the sedan's trunk, they found zip ties, rope, a tarp, and 3 other license plates. The fake mechanic's real name was Douglas Hartley, wanted in 3 states for attempted kidnapping. His partner was never identified. He gave a fake name and had no records anywhere. They'd been watching the Save Mart for weeks, waiting for women alone at night, cars that wouldn't start. Turns out they had a device that could disable certain car models remotely. All they had to do was wait for someone vulnerable and isolated. I was just the next target on their list. Carl got my car running. It was just a loosened battery cable, something that would have taken 5 seconds to fix if I'd known where to look. The police said Douglas probably loosened it while I was shopping, then waited. I drove home in a daze, hugged my sleeping daughter so tight she woke up confused, and told Nathan everything while we sat at the kitchen table until dawn. We installed security cameras the next day, and I never shop alone at night anymore. But mostly I think about that moment when I almost popped the hood for him a second time. How close I came to trusting that empty smile. How the only thing that saved me was deciding to verify his story with one phone call. Sometimes the smallest decisions make the biggest difference. That Friday night in October 2017 started like any other at Michigan State. I'd just finished my shift at the campus library and headed to my roommate's birthday party around midnight. The apartment was crammed with people from our communications program, red cups scattered on every surface, bass from the speakers making the windows vibrate. I stuck to water since I had to drive home later, just hanging out and catching up with classmates I hadn't seen all week. The place was alive with that specific energy you only get at college parties. Everyone talking too loud, laughing at everything, someone always trying to start a drinking game in the corner. By 2 a.m., the crowd was thinning out. Groups of friends were calling rides or making the trek back to the dorms, and I figured it was time to head to my apartment off campus. Brian Lawson was propped against the kitchen counter when I went to toss my cup in the trash. We had media ethics together, but had maybe exchanged 10 words all semester. He kept sliding down the wall and pulling himself back up, eyes unfocused, muttering about needing to get home. His friends had apparently left him behind. I'd seen them pile into someone's car an hour earlier. The guy was completely wasted, way past the fun drunk phase and deep into the barely functional territory. He was trying to type something on his phone but couldn't even unlock it properly, just jabbing at the screen with clumsy fingers. I asked if he had a ride coming and he just shook his head, then immediately grabbed the counter like the motion made him dizzy. I should have walked away. Everything about the situation screamed bad idea. This guy I barely knew, drunk out of his mind, needing help at 2 a.m. But there I was, watching him struggle to stay upright, thinking about how dangerous it would be if he tried to walk home alone. The campus had been having issues with muggings late at night, and Brian lived somewhere on the south side of town, at least a few miles away. Plus, it was getting cold. maybe 40 degrees outside, and he was just wearing a t-shirt. I kept thinking about my younger brother who'd just started college, imagining him in the same situation. After a minute of internal debate, I heard myself offering him a ride. Brian's face lit up with this sloppy, grateful smile, and he started thanking me over and over, his words all running together. Getting him to my car was an adventure. He insisted he could walk fine, then immediately tripped over the threshold of the apartment door. I had to basically prop him up with my shoulder, guiding him down 3 flights of stairs while he rambled about some girl named Ashley, who'd apparently been ignoring him all night. His breath reeked of cheap vodka and beer, that distinctive party smell that makes you gag. In the parking lot, he suddenly pushed away from me and started patting his pockets frantically, saying he'd lost his wallet. We spent 10 minutes searching under cars with my phone flashlight before he remembered he'd left it in his dorm room earlier. The whole time, this weird feeling kept creeping up my spine. Not quite fear, but this persistent unease about what I was getting myself into. Once we got in my beat-up Corolla, Brian seemed to perk up a bit. He fidgeted with the radio, jumping between stations every few seconds, then suddenly got serious and asked if we could make a quick stop. Said he needed cigarettes and Red Bull for the morning, that there was a 24-hour gas station on the way to his place. I just wanted to drop him off and go home, but he kept insisting, even offered to buy me gas for the trouble. The way he said it was strange, though. His whole demeanor shifted, became more focused, almost calculating. He gave me directions that led us away from campus, past the residential areas, toward the industrial part of town I'd never been to before. Every turn took us further from anything familiar, streetlights getting fewer and farther between, until we were driving through empty stretches of warehouses and abandoned lots. 20 minutes later, we pulled into this rundown gas station that looked like it hadn't been renovated since the 80s. One flickering neon sign, half the letters burned out, 2 ancient pumps out front. The place was completely isolated, no other businesses around, just dark fields and a chain-link fence surrounding some kind of storage facility across the street. Brian suddenly seemed completely sober, sitting up straight and staring at the store's entrance with this intense focus. He asked me to park on the side of the building, away from the cameras. That should have been my cue to leave, but he was already getting out, moving with a purpose that didn't match the stumbling drunk from an hour ago. He turned back and looked at me through the passenger window, and his expression made my chest tighten. "Come in with me," he said, and it wasn't really a request. Inside my head, every alarm was going off. But Brian was standing there waiting, and something in his stance told me that driving away wasn't an option anymore. I turned off the engine with numb fingers and followed him toward the store. Through the grimy glass doors, I could see a single employee behind the counter, an older guy, maybe 60, watching a small TV mounted on the wall. Brian pulled something from his jacket as we walked, and my legs almost gave out when I saw the black metal of a pistol. He must have had it on him the whole time, at the party, in my car. "Just stay cool and nobody gets hurt," he said quietly, like we were discussing homework. "You're gonna buy some items while I handle the rest. Act natural." My mind went blank. This wasn't happening. I was supposed to be home in bed, not walking into an armed robbery at 3 a.m. with someone I barely knew from school. The electronic chime when we entered sounded like a funeral bell. The cashier glanced up briefly, then back at his TV, some old Western movie. Brian moved casually toward the back of the store while I stood frozen near the entrance, pretending to look at the candy display. My reflection in the glass case showed a pale face I didn't recognize, eyes too wide, jaw clenched tight. Brian was taking his time, picking up random items, a bag of chips, an energy drink, like any normal customer. But I could see how his right hand stayed near his jacket pocket, ready. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, one of them flickering in an irregular pattern that made everything feel like a broken film reel. The cashier coughed, shifted on his stool, completely unaware that in maybe 30 seconds, his quiet night shift was about to explode into chaos. I wanted to scream a warning, to run, to do something other than stand there like a mannequin, but my body wouldn't respond to any commands my brain was sending. Brian approached the counter with his items, and I watched it happen like a movie in slow motion. He set everything down, waited for the cashier to start scanning, then pulled out the gun in one smooth motion. "Empty the register. No alarms, no heroes," he said, voice steady and cold. The old man's face went white, his hands shooting up instinctively before Brian told him to put them down and just do what he was told. The cash drawer popped open with a metallic ding that seemed to echo forever. Bills started piling up on the counter, 20s, 10s, 5s, 1s. Brian glanced at me and jerked his head toward the door. "Go start the car, now." But I couldn't move. My feet felt welded to the linoleum floor. The cashier's eyes met mine for a split second, and I saw my own terror reflected back at me. He was somebody's grandfather, probably, working the night shift to make ends meet, and here he was getting robbed at gunpoint because I'd been stupid enough to give the wrong person a ride. I said, "Go!" Brian's shout snapped me back to reality. I stumbled backward, knocking over a display of chips, the bag scattering across the floor with a rustling crash. Outside, the cold air hit me like a slap. My car keys were slick in my sweaty palm as I fumbled with the lock. The engine turned over on the third try, and I sat there gripping the wheel, watching the store entrance. Part of me wanted to drive away, leave Brian stranded, but I knew he had my student ID from when we'd been looking for his wallet earlier. He knew my name, where I went to school, probably could find out where I lived. Plus, abandoning him might make things worse for the cashier inside. Through the windshield, I could see movement. Brian backing toward the door, gun still pointed at the counter. Time stretched like taffy. Seconds felt like hours. Then he was yanking the passenger door open, diving in with a plastic bag stuffed with cash, yelling at me to drive, drive, drive. I slammed the car into reverse, tires squealing as we peeled out of the parking lot and into the empty darkness of the road. The next few minutes were a blur of Brian shouting directions, my speedometer climbing past 80 on empty back roads, and the constant terror that police lights would appear in my rearview mirror any second. Brian was counting money, laughing like he'd just won the lottery, completely high on adrenaline. $3 grand, maybe more, easiest score ever. He tried to stuff some bills in my cup holder, saying it was my cut, but I knocked his hand away. Told him I didn't want any of it, just wanted to go home. That made him laugh harder. "Too late for that, college boy. You're in this now." And we drove for what felt like forever before he finally told me to pull over, near some apartment complex I didn't recognize. Before getting out, he leaned close, gun visible again in his waistband. "You did good tonight. Keep your mouth shut and we'll both be fine. I know where to find you if you get any stupid ideas about talking to cops." Then he was gone, disappearing between the buildings like a ghost, leaving me alone in my car, shaking uncontrollably. I sat there for probably 20 minutes trying to process what had just happened. My phone showed 4:17 a.m. In a few hours, students would be waking up for Saturday morning practices, grabbing breakfast, living their normal lives, and I'd be carrying this secret that felt like it was burning a hole through my chest. Somehow I made it back to my apartment, double-locked the door, and collapsed on my bed fully clothed. Didn't sleep at all, just stared at the ceiling replaying every moment, wondering how giving someone a ride home had turned into armed robbery. That morning, local news reported the gas station theft. The cashier was unhurt but shaken. Police were looking for 2 suspects, one tall with dark hair, one shorter with lighter hair. My description. They had fuzzy security footage from outside cameras, my car pulling away. For weeks after, I jumped every time I saw a police car, certain they were coming for me. Brian disappeared from campus, dropped out, someone said, or maybe transferred. I never saw him again, never told anyone what happened that night. Changed my major, couldn't sit through ethics class anymore without feeling sick. Even now, years later, whenever someone asks for a ride late at night, my whole body tenses up. I always say no, always. Because I learned the hard way that sometimes trying to help the wrong person can destroy your life in ways you never imagined possible. The notification popped up on my phone around 3 p.m. that Thursday in March. "You've got a new match." I was working from home, sitting at my kitchen table in my cramped apartment in downtown Portland, reviewing spreadsheets for the marketing firm where I'd been an analyst for 3 years. Living alone had gotten expensive after my last roommate moved out 2 months earlier, so I'd been actively trying to meet new people, maybe find someone special. Dating apps weren't my favorite thing in the world, but at 28, with most of my friends either married or moved away, it seemed like the most practical option. I clicked on the profile. Ryan, 32, software developer, loved hiking and craft beer. His photos showed a clean-cut guy with sandy brown hair and what looked like genuine smiles, not those forced poses you usually see. We started messaging right away, and I was surprised by how easy the conversation flowed. He asked about my job, shared funny stories about debugging code at 2 a.m., and seemed genuinely interested when I mentioned my photography hobby. By evening, we'd exchanged probably 50 messages, and when he suggested meeting for dinner that Saturday at this Thai place called Bamboo Garden downtown, I immediately said yes. My roommate Valerie was in the living room when I told her about the date, and she gave me this look, you know the one, where someone's trying to be supportive but clearly has concerns. "Just be careful, okay? Maybe meet somewhere super public first, grab coffee or something," she said, pausing her Netflix show. I laughed it off, told her the restaurant was right on Morrison Street with tons of people around, and besides, we'd been talking for hours already. He seemed completely normal, even sent me a LinkedIn profile to prove he was who he said he was. Saturday came faster than expected. I spent the morning cleaning my apartment, then probably tried on 6 different outfits before settling on dark jeans and a burgundy sweater that made me feel confident without trying too hard. The restaurant was only a 15-minute walk from my place, and I decided to go on foot since the weather was surprisingly mild for March. Ryan had texted that morning confirming 7 p.m., even sent a screenshot of his reservation. When I walked into Bamboo Garden, the hostess immediately asked if I was meeting someone, and there he was at a corner booth, standing up and waving. He looked exactly like his photos, maybe even better. Wore a navy button-down that fit him well, had this easy confidence about him. The first hour flew by. We ordered pad thai and green curry, shared spring rolls, laughed about terrible first date stories we'd heard from friends. After dinner, when the check came, he insisted on paying, which I appreciated but also offered to split. "Next time's on you," he said with this charming wink. We stepped outside, and the evening air felt perfect, that kind of crisp but not cold that makes you want to keep walking. That's when he mentioned the nature trail. "There's this beautiful path about 10 minutes from here, goes along the river. I discovered it last month when I first moved to town. Want to check it out? We could walk off some of that curry." The way he said it seemed so casual, so spontaneous. Morrison Street was still bustling with people heading to bars and late dinners, and I figured a walk sounded nice. My phone buzzed with a text from Valerie asking how things were going, but I just quickly typed back, "Great, still out, tell you later," and slipped it back in my purse without really looking at the battery icon flashing red in the corner. The walk to the trail took us away from the busy streets and into a quieter part of town I didn't recognize. Ryan kept the conversation going, asking about my photography, whether I preferred landscapes or portraits. He even pulled out his phone to show me some sunset photos he'd taken recently, which made me relax even more. When we reached the entrance to the trail, I noticed how the streetlights kind of faded out, and the path disappeared into darkness beyond the first curve. "It's prettier during the day," he admitted, "but at night it has this peaceful quality. You can hear the river really clearly." Something made me hesitate for just a second, but he was already walking ahead, turning back to smile at me, and I didn't want to seem paranoid or ruin what had been such a good evening. The first part of the trail was actually lovely. We could still see the city lights twinkling through the trees, and the sound of water was calming. About 10 minutes in, the path narrowed, and the trees got denser. That's when my phone completely died. Not even enough juice to power on for emergency calls. I mentioned it to Ryan, kind of laughing about my bad timing, and he said not to worry. His was fully charged if we needed anything. We kept walking, but the conversation had shifted somehow. He started asking these odd questions. Did I have siblings? Were my parents still around? Did I have any health conditions? At first I thought maybe he was just making awkward small talk, but then he asked something that made me stop walking entirely. So this might sound weird, but have you ever thought about what you'd want to happen to your stuff? Like, if something unexpected happened? He tried to play it off as a philosophical question, said his friend had died recently, and it got him thinking about mortality. But the way he was looking at me in the darkness with no one else around made every alarm bell in my head start ringing. I tried to keep my voice steady when I answered. That's kind of a heavy topic for a first date, don't you think? I forced a laugh and took a small step backward, but he moved closer, closing the distance. His whole demeanor had changed. Gone was the charming guy from dinner, replaced by someone whose eyes looked almost hungry in the dim moonlight filtering through the trees. I'm just curious, he continued, his voice lower now. You live alone, right? You mentioned your roommate moved out. Must be nice having all that space to yourself. Do you have good locks? Security system? My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew he was taller, probably faster, and I had no idea which direction led back to safety. The trail had curved so many times I'd lost my bearings completely. You know what, I'm actually not feeling great, I said, trying to sound casual despite the tremor in my voice. That curry isn't sitting well. We should head back. But he didn't move aside. Instead, he tilted his head and studied me like I was some kind of specimen. You didn't answer my question about your belongings. Do you have life insurance? Any valuable jewelry at home? That camera equipment you mentioned must be worth something. That's when I knew with absolute certainty that this wasn't a date anymore, if it ever really was one. My mind raced through self-defense moves I'd learned years ago but never practiced, calculated whether I could knee him and run, wondered if anyone would hear me scream from this deep in the woods. Behind him, I could see the trail split into two paths, and I had no idea where either one led. All I knew was that I'd walked straight into a trap, and the man blocking my path had planned this whole thing from the moment he'd swiped right on my profile. Then something unexpected happened. From somewhere behind me, I heard voices, loud, drunk college kids by the sound of it, laughing and stumbling through the woods. Ryan's expression flickered with annoyance, and in that split second of distraction, I made my move. I shoved past him and ran toward the voices, screaming, "Help! Please help me!" at the top of my lungs. I could hear Ryan behind me, his footsteps crunching on the gravel, but I didn't look back. The group of students, maybe 5 or 6 of them, appeared around a bend, their phone flashlights swinging wildly. "This guy is following me!" I gasped, practically colliding with a girl in a University of Portland sweatshirt. "Please, I need help!" The students immediately closed ranks around me, and one of the guys, built like a linebacker, stepped forward. "Yo, dude, back off," he said to Ryan, who had stopped about 10 feet away, his face now wearing that same easy smile from dinner like nothing had happened. "Whoa, misunderstanding here," Ryan said, holding up his hands. "We're on a date. She just got spooked by the dark." But I was already telling the students everything, the weird questions, the asking about my will, how my phone was dead. The girl with the sweatshirt had her phone out, already dialing 911. Ryan's smile faltered when he realized the situation had spiraled beyond his control. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. But when 2 more male students stepped forward, he turned and walked quickly back the way we'd come, disappearing into the darkness. The students stayed with me until the police arrived, walked me all the way back to the trail entrance where 2 patrol cars were waiting with lights flashing. I gave the officers everything, his name, his profile, the restaurant where we'd eaten, though I suspected most of it was fake. They took my statement, drove me home, and said they'd investigate, but warned me that guys like this often used burner phones and fake profiles. When I got home, Valerie was waiting up, and the moment she saw my face, she knew something terrible had happened. I told her everything while she made me tea with shaking hands. both of us realizing how close I'd come to becoming one of those news stories you read about missing women. The next few days were a blur of changing my locks, installing a security system, and deleting every dating app on my phone. The detective assigned to my case called a week later. They'd found no trace of Ryan. The LinkedIn profile was fake, created just 2 days before we matched. The restaurant had security footage of us at dinner, but the quality was too poor to get a clear face shot. Even the reservation had been made with a prepaid credit card under a false name. He was like a ghost who'd materialized just long enough to almost succeed in whatever sick plan he'd had for me on that trail. It's been 3 months now, and I still have nightmares about that night. Sometimes I wonder how many other women he's matched with, how many said yes to that walk in the woods, and whether they all made it out. The detective told me I was lucky. Most predators who lure victims to isolated places have everything planned down to the smallest detail. The random appearance of those drunk students was probably the only thing that saved me. I've shared my story on every platform I can find, hoping it might save someone else from making the same mistake. People always think they can spot the red flags, that they'd never fall for something like this. But Ryan seemed perfect, funny, successful, respectful, right up until he asked about my will on a dark trail where no one could hear me scream. Now, when friends talk about their online dating adventures, I tell them this: meet in public, stay in public, and always, always trust that little voice in your head that says something's wrong. Because by the time you're sure, it might already be too late. The day started like any other. I had just gotten back from the grocery store with a trunk full of things I didn't really need, and was halfway through organizing the pantry when the knock came. It wasn't a neighborly knock. It was fast, messy, desperate, the kind that skips all politeness. I live alone in a quiet duplex just outside a small town in North Carolina, where the most exciting thing that ever happens is someone's dog getting loose. So that kind of knock? It doesn't happen here. At first, I didn't open the door. I looked through the peephole and saw this young guy, maybe in his early 20s, drenched in sweat, shirt stained dark red, pacing like he couldn't decide whether to run or collapse. His hair was matted, one sneaker was missing, and he kept glancing over his shoulder like he was being hunted. He knocked again, harder this time, and I heard him yell, "Please, man, I just need help, they're gonna kill me." Something about the way he said it, the panic, the cracking voice, made me hesitate. I knew I should have called the cops. That's what any rational person would do. But he didn't look like a threat, he looked terrified. And maybe I was just too curious for my own good. I unlocked the deadbolt but kept the door half cracked, chain still on. I asked him what was going on. He started blurting out fragments, something about people chasing him, needing a phone, that he didn't want to die like his friend. His eyes weren't right, though. They were bouncing everywhere, locked on things that weren't there. I should have seen it then, but I didn't. He asked to come in, I said no. I told him I could call someone for him, but he shook his head so violently I thought he'd snap his own neck. "No cops, please, man. Just let me catch my breath, please." He sounded like someone about to fall apart right on my porch. Against every warning bell going off in my head, I undid the chain and opened the door. He stumbled in and immediately dropped to his knees, gasping like he'd run through fire. I closed the door behind him and told him to sit on the couch, but he just stayed there on the floor, head low, rocking slightly. I tried to ask what happened, if he was hurt, if someone was after him, but his answers kept breaking apart, like his brain was skipping tracks. He mumbled about a van, someone named Marcus, then started whispering numbers like he was reciting a code. I crouched to get a better look at his side, and that's when I noticed the blood wasn't coming from a wound, at least not a fresh one. It was crusted in patches, dried in some places, like he'd been bleeding for hours. There was something raw in the way he moved. His hands kept clenching and unclenching, not like he was in pain, more like he was bracing for something. I offered him water, but he just looked at me, blinking too fast, like I'd asked him in another language. Then out of nowhere, he muttered, "Do you hear that?" I told him no. He shot up to his feet and started pacing, muttering to himself, pressing his fingers against the sides of his head like he was trying to push something out. I stepped back and finally reached for my phone on the counter. That's when he snapped. He lunged before I even touched the screen. 1 second he was across the room, and the next he was grabbing my wrist and shoving me into the fridge door so hard the magnets flew off. I barely got a word out before he was yelling, not at me, but at someone else, someone who wasn't there. "You said you wouldn't follow me. You said we were done." His grip tightened and he threw me onto the floor like I weighed nothing. I remember the cold linoleum on my cheek and thinking, this guy's not scared. He's gone. I scrambled to my feet and tried to put the kitchen island between us, yelling at him to calm down, to sit, to let me help. But he was somewhere else entirely. He started ripping open drawers, knocking over chairs, mumbling that they planted microphones and the walls were full of eyes. I didn't see a junkie or a kid in trouble anymore. I saw someone fully consumed by whatever hell was playing out in his head. And I was stuck in the middle of it with no backup, no weapon, and no way to reason with someone that disconnected from reality. I backed into the hallway, trying to keep something solid between us, but he followed fast. He wasn't yelling anymore. Now he was whispering, low and sharp, like we were both hiding from something only he could see. He kept saying, "They know," and "It's in the walls," dragging his fingers along the paint like he could feel something pulsing behind it. That's when he turned toward me again, not with rage this time, but with this wide-eyed certainty, like I was part of whatever nightmare he thought he was in. He charged. I didn't have time to think. I grabbed the only thing nearby, a lamp, and swung it as hard as I could. It connected with a sickening crunch, and he collapsed against the wall, then slumped to the floor. I stood there shaking, not because I was hurt, but because I had no idea if he was getting back up. I grabbed my phone and finally called 911. My voice cracked the whole way through the call. I couldn't even explain what was happening, just that someone was in my house, that he'd attacked me, that I didn't know who he was. While I waited, I locked myself in the bathroom and stayed there, listening to the silence, half expecting the door to burst open again. The cops and EMTs arrived fast. Turns out someone a few blocks away had already reported the guy earlier that day. Apparently he'd broken into a parked car outside a convenience store and then vanished before the police got there. He didn't have any ID on him, and they had to take him in for a psychiatric hold. One of the officers later told me it was likely he was in the middle of a meth-induced psychotic episode, probably hadn't slept in days. I gave my statement and watched them load him into the ambulance, strapped down and screaming at shadows only he could see. I changed the locks 2 days later. I still don't sleep well. Nothing like that had ever happened before, and I made one really bad call. I let chaos walk through my front door because it looked scared. I wanted to believe I could help, but now I look through the peephole a little longer. I trust silence more than words. And when I hear banging in the middle of the night, I don't open the door. I just listen and wait for it to go away.